All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this research update for the Arizona Office of Tourism. I'm Colleen Floyd, I'm the Director of Research. And so today we're going to cover a lot of what we covered in the Governor's Conference on Tourism in July, just an updated look. So in order to save bandwidth, I am going to stop my video and we'll go from there. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function. I'll try to check it as we go along, but also we'll leave time at the end. As usual, as with a lot of research presentations, this is going to be made available. Try not to worry about taking notes or anything like that. We'll definitely be providing the slides and the recording on tourism.az.gov afterwards. So sit back, relax, enjoy the numbers. All right, so we're going to cover visitation trends and the spending impacts of COVID-19. We're also going to talk a little bit about lodging and especially home sharing trends. We just contracted with AirDNA to look at the state market. Also updated tourism indicators, including gross sales, parks visitation, and air passengers. And then also one of the things I'm most excited about was our very first post-COVID visitor profile. So we purchased data from Longwoods quarterly, and this is the first full quarter of data that we're going to have of travelers who actually traveled during the pandemic. And then we're going to touch on county visitation trends. This is way too short of a webinar to cover every single one, so I'll show you where you can get your very own county visitation profile after the webinar. All right, so we'll start with the million-dollar question, and that's how many people actually traveled to Arizona since the pandemic. Now, we knew back in July that we had about 1 million fewer visitors in Q1, so January, February, and March. And then Q2, which covers April, May, and June, we saw 5.35 million domestic overnight visitors. And that's a 48% decrease in total overnight visitation from domestic visitors, which is a pretty significant drop. We've really seen nothing but year-over-year growth every quarter for the past few years, so that was disappointing. And here we can see this is just the percent change every quarter since 2017. So pretty dramatic, especially that 11%, given that there were only 2 weeks of Q1 where things really started to shut down. And this impacted every segment, domestic, international, business, leisure, but business really took a large hit. So in Q2, business travel was down by 2/3 compared to the down 45% for overnight leisure travel to Arizona. And then non-resident travel, so that's US travelers from anywhere outside of Arizona, fell 53%. Resident travel was a little more resilient, still a big drop, but not nearly to the extent of some of those other segments. Now, international visitation, this is modeled out a little bit farther out. We usually get international visitation once a year and usually halfway through the following year. So these are estimates that were made by Tourism Economics back in September. So we can see what regions are going to contribute to the drop. Last year, we welcomed about 6 million overnight international visitors. And then we're looking at about a 4.6 million visitor drop in 2020. And a lot of that clearly is coming from, or not coming as it were, from Mexico and Canada. So now, like I said, this forecast was made in September. And so this was pre-vaccine and a lot of other news that's happened since then. So at the time, Tourism Economics was forecasting recovery to pre-COVID levels by about 2024 in international visitation to Arizona. But I expect this to change. We'll get another update to this forecast around April, when I'm hoping it'll be a much rosier picture by then. The international spending forecast, I think we're probably pretty solid with the 2020 estimates. So we went from about $4.6 billion in spending in 2019 and down to about $1.1 billion in international spending. And that includes Canada and Mexico in here. And they're expecting about 2.7 in 2021. All right, so probably even more consequential than the actual number of visitors is total spending impacts. So Dean Runyon Associates, our economic impact vendor, has been modeling out monthly statistics. So these are all preliminary, but we'll keep monitoring this as time goes on. So we can see here that precipitous fall in March and April, and then kind of a pretty good uptick in May and June. Slower growth through July and August, but October was our best month yet. We were able to capture about $900 million in visitor spending in October. Still far below normal, but it's now we're starting to see maybe the seasonal trend. So that October shoulder season is showing up in the data. So cumulatively, usually by this point of the year, we would have had about $21.6 billion in spending in Arizona. This year, we're at about 10.2. So it's about an $11 billion deficit that we're looking at. And as we can see, we always want these year-over-year percentage changes to keep getting smaller. So, recovery happens quicker and quicker. Obviously, it was a big drop in April, but June through October, we seem to have stuck a little bit at around 60% of the normal of 2019 levels each month. So we do want to see that start to change. We want that number to get smaller and smaller. And of course, this lack of spending also has an employment impact. So this metric is a little bit tricky to talk about. So this is the number of jobs that could be supported by tourism spending. So it's not necessarily the jobs that exist or are high, it's just that there's enough spending in the economy to support these jobs. And so we were able to break 100,000 jobs in October, which is great news. It's the best number we've had since the beginning of the pandemic. Again, lots of work to do to regain that 195,000 employment number that is so important to our industry and to our state economy. And the same is true for state tax revenue from travel spending, still far below normal, but trending in the right direction. So since we don't have that particular metric modeled out to the county level, I find it pretty helpful to look at gross taxable sales in the 4 sectors that are most closely aligned with tourism. So we have amusement, restaurant and bar, retail, and hotel. And obviously locals are going to be in quite a bit of this, but it's a really good indicator. And these numbers are collected by the Arizona Hospitality Research and Resource Center at Northern Arizona University. So we're really grateful to them for putting all of this data together in one place. And you will notice as we go through that some counties are blank. If there aren't enough businesses submitting taxes in a certain area, for privacy reasons, they will group certain counties together, which is why you see Graham, Greenlee, and La Paz all looped together here. So we can see that amusement sales are pretty much down across the board, across the state. Now, restaurant and bar, we're really seeing the impact of the 2 counties that are really the most reliant on international travelers, Coconino and Santa Cruz. They're seeing some of the biggest drops, and that's not super surprising. And also in the counties with big metro areas. Retail is probably the rosiest of these 4. So lots of positive numbers year over year, which is great. But I always want to put out the reminder that this is going to include online shopping. So it's not necessarily a great gauge of how well our local businesses are doing. And then, of course, gross sales for hotels. Again, those counties that have either large metro areas and lots of hotel inventory, and also the ones that really rely on international travel are the ones that have been really challenged during this time. And this is year to date through, I believe, October. One thing to note is Yavapai and Gila County were big destinations for Phoenix travelers, especially during the spring and early summer, and Mojave and La Paz were real big destinations for Nevada and Southern California. So you can definitely see those places that managed to do pretty well during the pandemic. And looking at STR data, this is our hotel room demand for the entire state, and it's the year over year change. So again, down very dramatically in April, but we're climbing out of it very slowly. So September and October, we're looking a little bit better. And again, this is going to vary widely across the state in different markets. So again, a very similar pattern emerges. Those areas with international travel, lots of hotel, lots of metro areas, those are majorly challenged. But on the upside, one of the things that we've been keeping really close track of is traveler sentiment, and this is a study by Destination Analysts. And the percentage of travelers who rate staying in a hotel as somewhat safe or very safe has risen quite a bit since April, thankfully, and seems to have hit a happy medium somewhere around 35%. So the more branding and the more communicating that hotel brands can do about safety and health, I think it's definitely been working. Also, most people or a good chunk of travelers say that staying in an Airbnb or home rental is safe, although not as high as hotels. But that definitely brings us to the question of what is the impact of home sharing? There's been a lot of talk about whether or not Airbnb is going to overtake hotels or eat into that market share during the pandemic as people really look for a more socially distant experience. So we can see, and this is from 2014. So this is a long trend line of how Airbnb reservations have grown in Arizona over time. And we can see that it's just exploded in 2019. There's that huge peak in October of 2019. Still trying to figure out what event might have prompted that. But anyway, so lots of growth. But then we do see, I don't know if you can see my mouse right here. Here's the dip for the pandemic. And then we pretty much get back to last year's levels by June or July. So that's pretty quick recovery for this lodging segment. And then if we look at the online lodging tax collections, so basically bed taxes collected by these types of accommodations, September was actually a little bit higher this year than it was in September of last year. So they're back to growth. It's probably lower growth than they would have anticipated if there had been no pandemic, but it is definitely there. And then there's the question of what kind of percentage is it taking out of the regular lodging tax collections. So it looks pretty stable. Again, the online lodging is in blue compared to the hotel and motel taxes, which are in green. But because the hotel motel sector has been so depressed during this pandemic, they've been able to capture a higher and higher market share or share of tax collections. So we went from around 12% of total lodging tax collections, and now we're up over a fourth for 2 months in a row. So that's a pretty dramatic jump. AirDNA typically classifies studios and one bedrooms as the direct hotel competitors. I think it depends on your point of view, but we can see in the green and blue how those made up a larger chunk of Airbnb reservations early on back in 2014, but really by 2020, it's very evenly split between 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 and 4 plus bedrooms. Now, if we're looking at the amount of time before they book, so this is great to get an actual booking window for Airbnb reservations. The lead time has been growing, so we see all of these peaks around March. So this is spring training. Then you can see here where it flattens out when spring training started earlier in February instead of March. And then we have up here, same thing, February and March. And these lead times are pretty long. They're about 2 months, a little more last year. So that's not super surprising. I think we all know how hard it is to get a hotel room in the Phoenix metro area during spring training. So Airbnb is no different. So people are booking pretty early. Lead time has dropped quite a bit, but it's on the up, or it's growing again, but it's still, they're still booking their trips a lot faster than they used to. And then looking forward, so as of about 2 weeks ago, this was the forward look at room demand or at lodging demand for Airbnb. So we're still looking at a year-over-year decrease all the way through February and through most of March. And then by April, they anticipate the bookings are going to start growing again in April and May. So moving on to airport passenger volume, we can see that the line is very clear with the pandemic, and then we've climbed up a little bit, but we seem to have leveled out. Let's see. So now I've removed Sky Harbor so we can see the other airports a little more clearly. So Tucson's managed to hold on to passenger volumes despite September being kind of a time when volumes tend to go a little bit lower just seasonally. And it looks like passenger volume is generally lower to Phoenix Mesa Gateway in September. So we're starting to see some typical seasonal patterns, albeit at much lower levels than last year. And the same is really true for our regional airports. We seem to have recovered a little bit and then settled in at this new level for the time being. Now looking ahead to what the airlines are planning, in the blue we have seats that came into Sky Harbor a year ago compared to their plans as of now. Right now they're planning more seats in March than they offered last year, which is really good news. We'll always have to keep in mind that seats is going to differ from the number of passengers that are likely to fill those seats. And a few months ago when we were looking at this data, there were really big increases in the number of seats offered by Southwest, but we also knew that they had committed to keeping the middle seat blocked. So that was one of the reasons for that large increase. So these are the markets that the airlines are planning to serve and the number of seats over the next 4 months or so from December to March. And we see there's a lot of alignment with the markets that AOT has been focused on for the last few years. So we've really still been noticing some travel from even our long haul markets, even in summer. So Chicago is still showing up. New York was still low on both our Arrivalist data, which is mobile location, and in our airline data. So it's not super surprising to see it low down here. Another good piece about Dallas is they tend to be flying not just into Sky Harbor, but also into Tucson and Flagstaff. So that's a really great market for areas outside the Phoenix metro area. So air travelers, when they do come here, they're starting to stay longer. So you can see the average time for in Arizona by someone who visited or who came through Sky Harbor or Tucson, they both stayed a little bit longer than they did prior to the pandemic. So if they're making the effort to come out here, they're staying a little bit longer. You will be totally shocked to know they're also dwelling much shorter times at the airport. Surprise, surprise. All right, moving on to parks visitation. So we're seeing some lower visitation levels. Parks visitation has been a little bit difficult to track this year. I think there have been closures and just some challenges in collecting the data. So sometimes it changes, and I really encourage everyone to keep track of it at our website. We'll always post updates, and then in Tourism Tuesday, if there have been any revisions, we'll let you know through that too. So August is really the first month that we have all the parks reporting. And so it was, we're down about 48% as of August. And it just seems like Grand Canyon National Park is not bringing in the number of visitors that it normally would. It seems like other national parks like Yellowstone may be getting more traction from domestic travelers, but the profile of Grand Canyon is just so, my thought is that it's just so international that it's having a lot of trouble. All right, moving on to state parks. I think we all remember when they were so busy back in May, we had a little bit of a lower visitation in June and July and August, but September we're back in the positive. The historic parks are lower. A lot of those were closed completely during the shutdown, and they're still a little bit lower than they would have been at this time last year. But again, parks with lakes and water features, those are still doing really well. A little bit lower in June and July, but still definitely positive in September. And then the other nature parks are starting to rebound to what their 2019 levels were in August and September. All right, so visitor profile. So just a reminder, this comes from Longwoods International, and every year they sample, I think it's like 300,000 total visitors. So this is our sample for Q1 and Q2, just for the people who travel to Arizona. So I was a little bit concerned that because there was less travel going on that we would have a low sample, but that's not at all the case. It's actually one of the best samples we've seen in a while. So really reliable data. All right, so again, I just want to remind you guys, you don't have to take notes. This will be available. I'm going to whip through these to keep us on track. But one of the things I like to do is I like to compare more than one data set if I have that available to me. And so Q1 Longwoods versus Q1 Arrivalist. So just as a reminder, Longwoods is a survey. It's an online panel. People actually answer this very long survey, and Arrivalist is mobile devices sharing their location. So they're two very different sampling, and it's nice to know where they line up, and then we can ask questions about why they might not line up in different parts. So we can see here that the Arrivalist panel tends to be skew more towards those drive markets in neighboring states, and the long hauls are going to show up a lot more in Longwoods. Longwoods is going to filter out for people who generally consider leisure travel. So Arrivalist could be picking up people that are not leisure travelers, or maybe they just have, there's just very big differences in sampling. But it's nice when they line up, and there is quite a bit of alignment here. So now Q2, this is where I had a little bit of a head scratcher with New York, because it came up so high on Longwoods as a source market, and yet it doesn't show up at all in the top 10 in Arrivalist. And we've got other data sources that indicate that travel is probably pretty low. So we're kind of taking that with a little bit of a grain of salt right now. So main purpose of trip, this one surprised me. I really thought that, you know, from the people that I talked to, I thought that visiting friends and relatives would probably be one of the top trip purposes, given that, you know, if you're going to take the risk to travel, it's going to be to go see people you love. That's not necessarily what happened this year. So we can see in the blue this year for Q2, visiting friends and relatives actually fell a little bit. And outdoor trips definitely increased, which I don't think anyone is surprised about there. Travel parties didn't really change a whole lot. There's a little bit more traveling with parents and friends, but other than that, fairly similar. Total nights away. So there's sort of, it's not too different. There's a little bit more in the single night stays, but the one that I thought was really interesting was this bump in 21+ nights. So we may have some people doing workcations, or, you know, for taking advantage of virtual school or summer to just go somewhere and stay there for a little bit. This one did not surprise me, you know, given what we've heard from our resort properties, the stays at resort hotels have definitely gone down dramatically. And they seem to be shifting to other accommodation types that really are probably in more rural areas. So we've got lots of other hotels, bed and breakfasts, country inns or lodges, campgrounds went up quite a bit. So those are the things we kind of expected to see, given what we know and what we've been hearing this whole time. Length of trip planning, just like with the AirDNA data, trip planning windows are getting a little shorter. So we see a pretty good bump in 1 month or less planning, and then a lot of decreases as we get farther out. Now, trip planning information sources, I thought this was interesting. So for Q1 and Q2 of 2020, there were pretty good bumps in the people who said that they relied on TV, radio, magazines, and newspapers. So that was interesting to me. So it's good for us marketers who place advertising in there. And also I have to wonder too, if maybe during this time, if there was less destination marketing. And so those places that did market were just more memorable for the consumer, and they remember seeing those ads. And then good news for those of us in tourism offices, method of booking trip. There's a really big bump in those people who were booking through a visitor's bureau or a government tourism office. And I think that really reflects a desire to get some really solid information from government sites and trusted sites about health and safety. I know for us at visitarizona.com, our COVID resources page is by far one of the most heavily trafficked pages on our website. So it's not a surprise. And then again, we see a lot more use of short-term rental websites. So activities was where the survey changed a lot from last year to this year, so it wasn't really easily comparable, but it does seem like people are shopping a lot less on their trips. And National and State Park, which is over here, that's a lot lower than it usually is. That's usually in the top 5 activities. Demographics didn't change a whole lot, although we did see more visitation from people with a high school degree or less. And we also saw our highest percentage ever who reported a Hispanic background, which is really wonderful. We've been encouraging more diversity, so this is really exciting. All right, so last little bit. We're going to look at the Arrivalist data set, and I just want to do a quick reminder. So this is mobile devices that are in a giant pool of devices that Arrivalist tracks constantly. So what we have here are daily arrival patterns from January of this year to October 31st. So we can see, and in the blue we have overnight stays, and in the green we have the day trips. So I'm going to smooth it out a little bit so we can kind of see the pattern a little more clearly. So this is a 7-day moving average line rather than that crazy up and down weekend, weekday pattern that we were seeing a minute ago. And in the green line, we can see during the lockdown how those lines converge. So more people were giving up overnight trips, and day trips were becoming a more common trip type, but then they're starting to diverge again. And then we can see that we've had some pretty good bumps up here. October's looking really good. This was 2 weeks of fall break, I think was a sustained kind of 2-week peak. And it's calming down a little bit now. All right, so since this webinar is only an hour, and I know no one wants to hear me talk for that long, we are in the process of preparing one-pagers, much like if you were at the, or if you attended the virtual governor's conference. These will be posted at tourism.az.gov under regional profiles. So you can just find your county's visitation profile. So it would have that daily visitation pattern from January to October, as well as your top overnight origin markets. So that will be available shortly. But we're going to go through a sample of a couple of counties just to show how different things are depending on where you are in the state. And Coconino County has come up as having a lot of challenges with with limited international visitation. So it looks like, you know, things are on the rise in terms of the number of trips, but this could be a somewhat muted summer season. In terms of origin DMAs, and again, the Phoenix DMA, just think of it as the whole state. It covers, these are TV markets that are defined by Nielsen, and the Phoenix DMA is huge. And so is the Los Angeles one, but it's helpful to see sort of where they're coming from. So pretty good chunk coming from Phoenix. 47% of Phoenix arrivals had visited before. And then you can get a sense of how long they tend to stay. There's Denver right here. So they're a smaller percentage, but they stay for quite a while. So they're a great market, especially with that direct flight into Flagstaff. La Paz County, you know, there was hardly any blip during the early days of the pandemic. It dipped a little bit with visitation, but not a whole lot. And then we saw these big spikes for Memorial Day and Labor Day. And they're really drawing from Southern California quite a bit. So we see a lot of those markets coming up, and quite a bit of repeat visitation. LA, Fresno, more than half of those visitors come regularly. El Paso has a 62% repeat visit ratio, which I thought was incredible. And then of course, Maricopa County, we do see that very dramatic drop right after what was supposed to be our high season. And it's been a little muted. Still, we've got some bumps during September. It's still kind of moving along. And this is a market where we see a little bit less concentration of visitation from 1 or 2 cities, and it's more spread out. And then Yavapai County, I think a lot of us a lot of us in Phoenix and tend to head up north, head to Sedona, head to that area. So there was a pretty big uptick in April and May of lots of people visiting. So, and we can see that almost 45% of those people were from Phoenix, but plenty from Southern California, still pretty drive market heavy. But then we do see Chicago, San Francisco, and Denver, and they've got those really nice long lengths of stay. And then Yuma County, we're starting to see some growth. And I really think that this is going to trend up a little more sharply as winter progresses. It's getting there as the weather cools down. And again, so this is very Southern California and Arizona centered, but I think this is going to change. I personally know of a couple people who are planning on spending, I think, all of January in Yuma. So I know they're coming. All right, so that concludes the resources and research. So if you have any questions, and I'm gonna check the Q&A in just a second, but there's plenty of resources. The tourism.az.gov website has most of our research, and we're always here as a resource to you. This COVID-19 Miles Partnership link is a really nice one. It just synthesizes a whole bunch of national research on one page, so you can kind of go nuts exploring all of this stuff. US Travel Association has a lot of really great research, including weekly spending estimates by state. And also, I just wanted to point out that we are currently promoting our partnership with Leave No Trace. Our office has partnered with the Leave No Trace Center for Outdoor Ethics to really promote responsible outdoor practices and make sure our visitors are enjoying and caring for these beautiful Arizona landscapes that we love so much. So let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll hang out for like a few more minutes to see if we have any Q&A.